As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather today is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. C'est un grand plaisir pour nous de vous voir en si grand nombre ici. We're delighted to have IRPP Research Director Stephen Tapp, HEC Montréal's Ari Van Ash, and Robert Wolfe from Queen's University, the co-editors of the book and the leaders of this research initiative, here with us this afternoon, and we certainly look forward to the presentation of your research findings. For the last 40 years, that has been the mission of the IRPP, to conduct research and generate new knowledge to better understand the policy challenges facing Canadians and their governments. In addition to publication, therefore, it's critically important for us to create occasions like this one to bring together leading academic researchers and decision makers for thoughtful exchanges on the issues that keep our leaders up at night. And one tweet at a time, coming out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, trade is definitely becoming one of those issues. And so thank you to all of you for joining us today, and an especially warm welcome to Mel Kapp, a former president of the IRPP. I love that Mel still uses the pronoun we when he talks about the Institute. C'est un grand plaisir de t'avoir avec nous. To provide some context for our discussion, it's my pleasure to introduce the Honourable John Manley, President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada. As we all know, as a senior member of the federal cabinet for a decade, John has been on the front lines of a lot of those issues. And as the policy voice for of the CEOs of Canada's largest firms, he brings a critical perspective to the decisions our governments will be facing in the months to come. I should also note that John and his colleague Brian Kingston are contributors to the volume, and a great friend of the IRPP. Alors, sans plus tarder, John, à vous la parole.
Je suis ravi de participer aujourd'hui, mais vous avez oublié d'expliquer la raison pour laquelle je suis le porte-parole à ce moment. It was because Brian and my paper was chosen the best paper in the book. That's why I got to speak. Isn't that right? Sorry to the other authors, but, you know, runner-up is still pretty good, right? This is a very impressive volume. I could tell you that I've read it from cover to cover. I could tell you that. It wouldn't be true, but I could tell you wouldn't necessarily know that now until now that I've confessed it. But it is a very important and timely contribution to the debate that is just getting underway. And I'm only going to take a couple minutes to sort of set the stage, because I think the really important stuff is yet to come. And some of what I'm going to say is a little bit self-evident, but have we ever before found that our most important trading relationship was described by the President of the United States as the worst deal ever negotiated in the history of the world? I think not. As a veteran, and you know, a truth that must be told, I was a candidate in the 1988 election. I remember that campaign very well. Our party started by questioning whether the agreement that we'd entered into with the United States really met all of the criteria that it should have met. And that was a worthy debate. Partway through the campaign, we seemed to be on the side of never having an agreement with the United States, and a few of us found ourselves elected with a sense of relief that maybe we didn't have to deliver on what the leaders seemed to have promised. That's a bit of an uncomfortable truth, because in fact the aftermath of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA has proven enormously beneficial for Canada. And you don't need to go very far in your research to determine that to be the case, as you look at the fact that trade increased more between Canada and the United States in those areas where the tariffs have been reduced the most, which is exactly what you would expect to have happened. The lost jobs that we feared didn't really materialize, at least not because of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. The supply chain network that was hoped for actually did begin to develop and has developed. And I think overall the balance sheet is pretty clear that this arrangement has been beneficial to Canada. To have it now thrown really into a state of complete uncertainty is what has set the stage for a careful examination of Canadian trade policy and practices going forward. So this is all of that to say this is a very timely project, and one that policy thinkers and political leaders need to get their minds around very quickly in a rapidly changing universe. A couple of things that come out of the volume that I think I'll emphasize, and I think I won't follow a text here. I'll just give you a couple of thoughts that I think are important in order to turn our minds to it before opening it up to the presentations. One of the messages that comes out clearly, and it's almost a subtext of Canadian trade policy over the last 40 years, is we need to diversify. And we've had a number of initiatives at diversification. What I think we can state pretty categorically is that the gravitational pull of the large U.S. economy and its proximity to us makes it very hard for our little planet to break through that gravitational pull and begin circulating with other planets. That's the case, but the need to do it is becoming perhaps greater, in part because of our concern over protectionism emerging to the south, but also because we're starting to feel the gravitational pull of some ever increasingly large planets. China has emerged since, if you remember in these terms, really since the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement was negotiated. That was only 5 years after China began really reforming its economy. It was just not a significant factor when you looked at global trade patterns in 1987. Today, it's the second largest economy in the world, Canada's second largest trading partner, and vitally important. And that's just one piece of that massive Asian economy that is getting bigger and bigger at an exponential rate every day. So instead of sitting around as we did in the 70s and 80s and thinking about, is there a third option for us and expanding our trade, in fact, it's smacking us right in the face. That the growth of an Asian middle class, the development of Asian economies, is crying out, first of all, for much of what Canada has, and Canadian firms and Canadian governments need to spend a lot more time and effort not only being connected with these emerging and important economies, but also understanding them in ways that is not intuitive to us, in the way that understanding more or less what happens in the United States has been intuitive. So that's really, in that broad context, the first observation that I would make that I think is well substantiated in the book that you have before you. And I think the second observation that I would make is that the studies reveal the great importance of scale in business enterprises engaging in international trade, particularly when we look at economies and countries that are farther afield from Canada. The challenge to a small or medium-sized enterprise in mounting the effort, building the capital, and finding the skilled people to establish bases in Asian economies in particular, but that could be said of other areas as well, is just too great for them to do it and the number that we need, given the importance of the SME component of the Canadian economy. It's Canada's large enterprises, I represent many of those, that have shown the most success and the most willingness and the most patience and clearly the deepest pockets in order to begin to build those trading relationships. So one of the things that emerges from this that I hope the panels discuss is what we need to do to enable those SMEs that have products and ideas and meet the needs of that are emerging in these new trading partners of ours, to ride on the coattails of our larger enterprises, to participate in supply chains, to grow the scale that's necessary in order to become part of an international economy. So that those are the two observations that I would underscore for you, that we're looking at a time when diversification has never been more important, and Asia cries out to us. Not to overlook the importance of CETA or other trade arrangements or other emerging parts of the world, but Asia is there. We are a Pacific country. It's there for us. And secondly, the importance of building scale within and among our enterprises in order to ensure that we build the base of Canadian businesses that are able, in fact, to create jobs here, to create activities here in support of activities abroad. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion and the debate today. I think it will be informative for all of us. I hope that our policymakers take some ideas from this and run with them. Thank you, Graham.
So let me say maybe two things to distinguish myself from former Deputy Prime Minister John Manley. Number one, I have read this book cover to cover, all the way through, front and back, hundreds of times. Number two, I was not a candidate in the 1988 election campaign. You might not know that by looking at me. So John's right. In terms of what's happening right now, Canadians are focused very much on playing defense and be reactionary and looking at what might go wrong with the U.S. So I think right now, the picture that Bob and Ari and I thought would be a nice way to convey this is Canadian trade policy is a bit of a fog or a haze right now. There are some clouds on the horizon. There may be a tweet storm coming, and we don't really know when that might be. And if we're stuck in the woods and we need to figure out, see the forest for the trees, we need the compass. We need to know what's the long-run priorities that Canada needs. It's not a reactionary view. It's proactive, it's calm, it's deliberate. It's where does Canada want to go in 5 years and 10 years' time? And how do we set the course? And how does the U.S. fit into that general model? So that's what we're going to try to forward today in the 30 minutes that we have. And the book will get into much more detail. But we've been working away on this book for over the last 2 years now. And as we've done that, there have been on-again, off-again travails with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we thought was going to be approved, but was not, and then eventually came back. We've had investor-state dispute settlement issues flaring up in Canada-European. And then we've also had the issues that people did not expect in Brexit or in Trump. So there was a lot of things that we were trying to, in all cases, look ahead and not get too caught up in the near term and really focus on what we thought Canadian trade policy priorities would be. And so we stuck to these basic approaches, and this is a contribution that we think that we're making to the debate here. So it's medium term, it's forward looking. Again, it's what are Canadian policy priorities and what does it need to be, where we need to be headed in 3 to 5 years' time. It's empirical. We have a new evidence base. We're contributing firm level evidence, global value chains evidence that Ari's going to talk about in terms of the analytical approach. And we're really trying to underpin this. How do we understand how Canadian firms are choosing to participate in the global economy, where they're doing their tasks here and there, and how they're integrating into these supply chains? It's international. We had 31 different authors, and we have authors from 8 different countries. So we tried really hard to engage people from Europe, people from Asia, Australia, and try to really get a global view of Canadian trade. And it's been interdisciplinary. So Ari is at a business school. Bob's at a policy school. I do economics. We had people from law as well. So we had practitioners and we had people that were on the ground looking at things, and we had a very comprehensive, we think, view of Canadian trade. And what those people thought we should be doing, then at the end of the day, we take 650 pages and you say, well, what do you really know about this? Have we learned anything from this? What do we know? And I think in order to see this bigger picture, we need to see trade as part of the economic system. There are a lot of anxieties that people have right now. Technological change is advancing, and people are very excited about that in terms of their smartphones and what they can do with Uber. But in terms of the production side, they're a little bit concerned about, is my job at risk from automation? Are things going on? In terms of the long-run growth that we've had over the past 30 or 40 years has been captured increasingly by those at the top of the income distribution. And so people are worried about that. We know that people at the top of the income distribution have increased their share because there's more demand in this global economy in terms of higher skills, and there's a bigger ability on their part to capture the gains from production. So I think people in general are worried that maybe the economy is not working for them, and in this environment, what we've had is economic concerns that maybe the economy is not working for me have actually become a target and focused on maybe the trade deals aren't working for you. And maybe that's the political message that resonates with people. Okay, and so what we think Trump has tapped into is a broader anxiety, channeling this toward trade deals. And that may not necessarily be the case. That may not necessarily be right, but that's the way the politics are playing out right now. In Canada, we've taken a very different view. We're much more outward looking. We want to engage the rest of the world. And the government's pitching a progressive trade agenda. It's a very, very different look between what you see in the US. So what my job is to sort of set the table and give an overview of what our key recommendations are. And as I turn to those, let me just say trade deals in particular, that trade policy and trade is about much, much more than trade deals. So it's not just about the rules that govern international commerce. It really is about what we do inside our borders. It's how well connected we are to people outside of our borders, and those are the important issues that I think people need to keep in mind. So we have 4 main recommendations through all this work, and the first one is an overarching recommendation, and that is to develop more inclusive trade policy. And so what we mean, the government has talked about progressive trade. What we mean is, quote, inclusive trade. What we mean by that is a trading system that is open to more SMEs, to more women entrepreneurs who are trying to connect to global markets, and inclusively being open more to international developing economies and emerging markets. We think that's important to sort of make sure that the global trading system is more accessible to those folks, but also it's important to channel the benefits of technological progress and globalization so that within economies, the benefits are shared more broadly. I think that's job one for trade policy right now, is maintain confidence in the system. If people believe that the benefits of trade are going to go to a narrow few at the top, they will resist any further efforts to use trade integration to further our growth objectives. So that's the first thing that we think. Miles Korak in his paper on inequality has made the point that economists very, very often go to the point of productivity and efficiency, and that's where we go and that's where we end. And so the first point is let's increase productivity. And we say that, and that's coming up next. But if you want to get there, you need to ensure that these gains are being more broadly shared and that there's more buy-in from other people. We're not leaving as an afterthought the distribution. We're putting it front and center. So this is our first priority, and we had discussions of where it is. It's front and center. So what trade is an important part of an inclusive growth strategy. So again, we're looking at trade as a whole of a part of a bigger thing. Inclusive growth efforts are needed in terms of the economic outlook because in the labor market, people don't really know whether this or that change has resulted in that box that I have there in inclusive trade. It's very fuzzy boundaries. We don't know what's trade related. We don't know what is other. So what that means is you need a comprehensive package. We can't just look at trade policy, as Bob's going to get into talking about the negotiations of who, what, where, and what rules we do. But it really is looking at trade at the core in terms of contributing to broader growth in an inclusive way, and thinking about the labor market outcomes. So what are the labor market policies for retraining, for skills, on education side, trade infrastructure, looking at competition policy to make sure that there's competition domestically, innovation and taxes for companies across borders. So it really is thinking of trade policy and trade in its broader context and thinking of what trade can do, what trade should do, and what trade should be responsible to do. And again, we really think we can't get there. If there's no public confidence in the system, we don't get to step 2. And step 2 is facilitating resource reallocation. This is something we've known for quite a long period of time. What is trade good at? Trade is good at reallocating resources in an economy to make it more productive. So we've thought through comparative advantage for decades that we shifted resources between sectors from shrinking sectors into faster growing sectors. We know that to be true today. But in addition, we're drilling down at the firm level, and we're seeing that really where the growth is coming from is from moving from shrinking firms to growing firms within industries. And so that's something that we know now that we didn't really know 20 years ago. So that's important. And if we want to tap into this high-powered, potent weapon of trade, then we need to make sure that we're flexible. So when the global economy is changing, we're able to move resources to their best uses, going to where they need to be. Point 3. If the first point was about equity considerations, the second point was about efficiency considerations. Point 3 is also building on efficiency, and Ari's going to talk about, we all know we live in an interconnected global economy. Ari's going to talk about that, but how this changes the way we think about this is we need to think hard as Canadians about how do we promote policies that make the border thinner and that allow us to connect quickly and rapidly and reliably to other partners, regardless of which country they're in. This is the interdependence now of our exports is dependent to a large extent on our imports. Our trade depends to a large extent on our foreign direct investment. So we need to see these things very, very comprehensively and very cohesively together. And I think there are a lot of concerns now about foreign competition that I mentioned, some of these issues. and displacement of workers. But the best approach now is not to turn away from that. It's not to build the borders. It's instead to collaborate more with people, to get more productive, and to start to make the trading system work better for us. Final point. 4, build a stronger rules-based global trading system. So this is something which, as Bob says, not always fashionable at the time to be talking about the WTO or talking about multilateral approaches first. But it really has the benefit of being true and what we need to be doing right now. So for a middle power like Canada, it's always been the case that going it alone is not going to be able to work for us. We're going to have to work with partners to build the global trading system that we need. And that means that this outward-looking multilateral view of the world, which has long served us well, is even more important today, and probably has never been more important. This is our best bet. And there's a lack of global leadership, and there's a southern neighbor looking inward. And so we need to be part of that coalition that's building this comprehensive, this inclusive trading system that we can benefit from. This is really useful because as part of a kind of future-proof trading system, we don't know where activity is going to be in 10 or 20 years' time. But if we work and build a coherent multilateral system, that can help us out because we can take advantage of trade regardless of where it is. So that's an overview of the 4 main things that we're talking about, as you see in the slides there. Ari's going to talk now about the analytical underpinnings of firm-level trade and global value chains.
So thank you very much. So indeed, what I'm going to focus on is why we care so much about trade. And the reason is because trade ultimately creates productivity growth and creates economic growth. And so there's been a lot of new insights that have come from economic studies that have been trying to find out what the main mechanisms through this occurs. And so the first insight that we want to build on is ultimately that trade is dominated by large firms. So you see this very well in the following figure here, which demonstrates that of all the Canadian exporting firms, there's only about 3% that have more than 500 employees, but this 3% of all firms are responsible for 60% of total exports. And so there's been a burgeoning literature in international economics that has tried to understand why this might be the case, and secondly, why this is important to understand the gains from trade. And so the first point, which is in line with what has been said before, is that the reason why bigger firms are able to dominate trade is because there is an important fixed cost that is related to exporting. And so what this means is that only those firms that have enough resources to jump over the fixed cost hurdle are able to start exporting, while the smaller firms that don't have the resources, they are stuck in only selling on the local market. Now, you can immediately see what the policy implications of this is, because if the government can reduce the fixed cost of exporting, then those firms that will be benefiting from this automatically will be the smaller firms who can start entering into the market and start scaling up. The second thing that this literature points out is that if we take into account that there is firm heterogeneity, that trade is dominated by big firms, there are actually new reasons why trade can induce productivity growth. So when you have trade liberalization, what happens is that those firms that are productive and are more competitive, they start scaling up their production and exports. And so we've got more resources going into these firms that are bigger and more productive. At the same time, there's more competition coming from overseas, so smaller firms that are less competitive, they start losing market share and they start shrinking. So there is less resources going into these less productive firms. So if you take the aggregate picture, smaller firms are shrinking, bigger firms and more productive firms are expanding. So what happens is that you've got more resources going into more productive firms, leading to an aggregate productivity boost. And there's a lot of evidence that this is exactly what is going on in Canada. So after the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, there was a significant increase in manufacturing productivity, and more than 60% of that was the shrinking of less productive firms and the scaling up of more productive firms. Only 39% was actually firms that themselves started becoming more productive because of the trade agreements. If you look at the Canada-Chile Free Trade Agreement, you saw a big boost in exports. Well, 90% of the export increase was firms that before were not trading with Chile who now started exporting. Only 10% of the export increase was because existing exporters started exporting more. So what this means is that our understanding of how trade agreements lead to economic growth has been refined with these new studies. So what does this mean? Well, it leads to our second policy pillar, after the first one being inclusive trade, which is we need to make sure that we facilitate resource reallocation. It is the key mechanism through which trade leads to productivity growth and economic growth. It occurs because we see a resource reallocation from less productive sectors to more productive sectors, from less productive firms to more productive firms. And so in any trade policy agenda, this is a key mechanism that has to be in place in order to be able to move forward. The second thing, of course, is, which we have to take into account, is that not every type of resource reallocation is equally good, especially if we take into account inclusive trade. So, for example, you could imagine more targeted trade policies that can lead to a more inclusive resource reallocation that favor, for example, smaller firms, if we, for example, focus on reducing the fixed cost of exporting. The second insight that we really focus on in the book is global value chains. Here's an example of a global value chain. Is a Boeing 787, which is a plane that is not being produced by Boeing, but is produced by many, many different companies that are located in many different countries. Now, this is really important because what we have here is a collaboration of firms to create value added together. This goes against a long-standing thinking about trade, which is that we're living in an us versus them world. In this case here, us and them are working together to get something done. And we can see this very clearly in a whole lot of data. So here what I'm showing you is the share of foreign value added in different countries' gross exports. For Canada, it stands at around 25%. In other words, for every dollar that Canada exports, there's about 25 cents that is being made in another part of the world. In other words, our firms need to collaborate with foreign suppliers in order to get things done. Okay. Now, this is looking upstream. We can also look downstream. So there's a lot of Canadian firms that are exporting to the United States, but it's not because things are being consumed in the United States, but it's because it is being sent there, transformed into another product that then is being sent to the rest of the world. And you can see this here in this graph where I'm showing that of our gross exports, there is about 2/3 in 2011 that went to the United States. But if we look at what percent of what we make that is ultimately being consumed in the United States after going through global value chains, it's only at around 58% in 2011. In other words, there is a lot of evidence that we are often collaborating with American firms downstream in order to become more competitive in the global economy. So the insights I kind of get from global value chains is that we need to take into account that our productivity not only depends on what we do ourselves, but it also depends on our ability to connect to strong other players. If we connect to a weak player, it's going to reduce our productivity. If we connect to a strong partner, it's going to increase our productivity. The second thing that I think is very important is that right now competition in the global economy is no longer just firm against firm. It has become increasingly value chain against value chain. The third important insight that we make in the book is that we should be spending much more attention on services. Services are responsible for 86% of our employment, is responsible for 76% of our GDP, is responsible for 45% of our value-added exports, and probably that 45% number is an underestimation because services firms do not generally use exports to reach foreign consumers, but they much more are using foreign direct investment. And that's actually what I'm showing you here, that if we just look at exports, services are responsible for about 20%. If we look at foreign affiliate sales, services are responsible for more than 50% of our foreign affiliate sales. Okay? This is important because what it means is that when services firms go to policymakers, they have very different demands than goods producers. For them, protection of foreign direct investment, for example, is something much more important. Regulatory cooperation also is much more important. So this leads us to our third policy pillar, which is that we need to promote international connectivity. We need to make sure that our firms can connect better to the strongest partners with who we can become strong. And so there's a couple of things that are important to look at over here. So the first thing is that we not only want to be promoting exports, but we also want to look at liberalizing imports, because imports is a main mechanism through which we connect with our upstream suppliers. The second thing that is very important is that we not only should be focusing on the facilitation of the transmission of goods, but also of capital and information, because again, these are very important in our collaboration with other firms. We not only want to focus on what is happening at the border, tariffs and all these things, we also want to focus on what is happening behind the border, because our transportation infrastructure and how well it's integrated with those of the rest of the world is critically important. Our communication infrastructure is really important. Our cooperation with other countries in regulatory aspects are also very important. About rules of origin, we have to be very careful about them, because rules of origin is ultimately a way to make sure that we cannot necessarily connect with our strongest partners, and especially for services firms, but not only for services firms, thinking of foreign direct investment as a key element of a trade policy agenda is critically important. So I'll let Bob come for the last policy pillar.
Well, you might think we're in the situation where everything's been said, but not everybody's said it. But there's still more to say, if I can find the clicker. So I want to start by recalling where Steve started us off. My job is to talk about trade deals, but we want to keep our eyes on the forest, not the trees. It's not surprising that trade deals have become a political target, given all of these economic anxieties about trade and globalization, even if trade is not the primary cause. That's one of the reasons why so many trade negotiations are struggling at the moment, and it's partly why President Trump wants to renegotiate NAFTA. So, of course, NAFTA is front of mind today for Canadians. But we should not let those essential negotiations obscure other important objectives. It now seems likely that we will have provisional implementation of our ambitious agreement with Europe before the summer, but domestic anxieties about trade and globalization are part of an explanation there, too, of why full ratification remains elusive. We need to think of ways to work with China, to work with Japan, to work with India, and we need to be cognizant of the strengths and weaknesses of the regional comprehensive economic partnership, something we don't hear about much in Canada. It may not amount to much on rules issues, and we tend to think more about rules issues than others, but it could be a very big deal for market access, because many of the participants have high tariffs. And that could have implications for Canadian trade, whether we're left out of it, whether we think of joining it, as could the One Belt, One Road initiative that dominated the trade news this past weekend and suddenly is on the front page of the Globe and Mail this morning. Developing countries are a huge opportunity. Trade liberalization, trade integration can advance shared prosperity, improve the welfare of all citizens. And over time, growth in trade is going to be coming from those countries, not from us, not from Europe. Our traditional trading partners like us, if we grow 2 to 3% a year, will be happy. Developing countries, if they're not growing at more than 6% a year, are not happy. That's where the greatest opportunities are. That's where we have a contribution to make it towards their advancement, and our trade policies have to be supportive. We see the merit of current conversations with the other participants in TPP. A reconfigured TPP might be the best deal we can get with Japan in the short term, and maybe even in the long term. But each chapter of TPP is going to have to be assessed to determine if the compromises that were made to satisfy the Americans still make sense when they're not participating. Rules of origin would pose a particular challenge for Canada, given the dependence of many sectors on inputs from the United States. These considerations lead to our 5 sets of recommendations on how Canada should work with other countries. As Steve has already said, we think Canada should be prioritizing multilateral action. recognizing the importance of North America and Europe, while paying special attention to Asia, and never forgetting how trade and development can be mutually supportive. I'm going to talk about just 3 of those recommendations. The Doha round, as we all know, is on life support, but in the long run, negotiations in the WTO will be essential to create an integrated global trading system. A patchwork network of bilaterals and regional agreements will not serve our interests. So in the short term, we have to keep the lights on in the WTO to ensure it's there when the major players are ready for it again, and because its transparency and dispute settlement mechanisms are vital now. Not least because they're much more effective than anything any regional agreement has yet developed. Canada should be contributing to a successful outcome in Buenos Aires. Fisheries subsidies could be the marquee item this year. A little bit of a problem sometimes for Canada. We're a sometimes friend of fish. And as always, the package will need something on agriculture. Maybe it will need something on domestic regulation and services. But given the apparent disinterest of the Americans and the apparent eagerness of China to assume a leadership role, there may be an opportunity for Canada to leverage some of our traditional strengths, perhaps by convening small groups with China to think about novel initiatives to keep the lights on, perhaps including things like using more plurilaterals within the WTO framework. Of course, NAFTA is job 1 at the moment, and we still have absolutely no idea what the US might want in a renegotiation. It's quite clear that the president doesn't either. But our analytic framework leads us to certain observations. The overwhelming objective, which we share with Mexico, has to be protecting the operation of our highly integrated North American value chains. That's the overwhelming task. And that's where we have to worry if rules of origin become more restrictive. The Canada-US Regulatory Cooperation Council is one of the most sophisticated examples of regulatory cooperation in the world, but we can go farther. We could create groups of stakeholders to identify all regulations with significant impacts on firms all along supply chains. There could be many things that are outside NAFTA that could make a difference, for example, to the health of North American auto production. Stronger Buy America rules are obviously a huge risk for Canada, but the Americans might be tempted by the kind of access that the Europeans will get under CETA. Chapter 19 provides an alternative to judicial review by domestic courts of final anti-dumping and countervailing duty determinations. Canada fought for it, shouldn't give it up easily, but it may not be worth dying in the ditch for. We are skeptical of the real value of bilateral deals for increasing trade flows. And yet they can be hard to conclude, which is a problem because of the resource constraints facing Canadian trade negotiators. Nonetheless, we do support the exploratory conversations that are now underway with China. Bilateral negotiations with that country would help both sides learn about how to further integrate them into the global trading system, with the ultimate goal of getting back to the WTO when the US and China are ready for a serious negotiation there. That process of learning may not lead to formal rules in a trade agreement, but getting a deal with China will require new thinking about what trade agreements look like. We end with what is in fact our first pillar. The overarching objective of Canadian trade policy should be to develop inclusive policies that help more Canadians share in the benefits of globalization and technological progress. SMEs and first-time traders may have a harder time finding the information they need to participate in foreign markets. There are striking disparities between men's and women's participation in trade. Canada could regularly examine the effects of trade agreements on the advancement of women's economic empowerment, including supporting such efforts in the WTO's trade policy review mechanism. Ensuring public confidence in the process of reaching new agreements is fundamental. That requires not just consultation, which can be a one-way street, but wide discussion of the government's objectives in any negotiation. If the public understands those objectives, they may be less likely to want details of the bargaining in real time. Fair to ask how Canada could pursue an inclusive agenda. First, never forget that much of that agenda are things that the government can and should do on its own. The international aspects are more challenging. The Environmental Goods Agreement, for example, is a limited deal that has been hard to negotiate. Aspirational objectives are easier to incorporate in environmental and labor chapters of an FTA than binding rules. Every country can agree to binding constraints on tariffs at the border, but seeing some domestic policies as fit topics for a trade agreement is less obvious. Could we have a progressive agreement with China? Last month, Jerry Ritz said in the committee hearing that I'd love to be a fly on the wall when you break the news to China that they have to include gender parity in an agreement. Well, maybe he should have been in China last September when the G20 adopted an action plan on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which include gender and human rights and other aspects of a progressive trade agenda. Trade issues can't be isolated from other economic, social, and environmental factors needed for inclusive growth and sustainable development. The universality of the SDGs might help us break down the us versus them mentality that often gets in the way of mutual understanding and progress at the WTO. And the G20 Action Plan provides a framework for reviewing progress on the SDGs. But while all UN members may accept principles of a progressive trade agenda, they don't see the SDGs as enforceable. Transparency can be an alternative, however, to binding rules. Countries can agree to monitor progress on shared goals. There can be many ways to pursue an inclusive trade agenda that does not require incorporation in a formal agreement subject to binding dispute settlement. Indeed, a willingness to accept more informal approaches based on transparency may help not only with the inclusive trade agenda, but with difficult subsidies issues like those involving state-owned enterprises. In short, the jewel in the WTO crown may well be its committees, not the appellate body. To conclude, Canada needs a trade policy agenda that is more inclusive, facilitates resource reallocation, promotes international connectivity, and builds a better global trading system. Thank you very much.